On a small island in the middle of the Nile, near the southern border of Egypt, stands the ancient Egyptian temple complex of Philae. This temple was the last haven for pagan worship in Egypt, with ancient Egyptian religion surviving in the area until the 5th century AD. The temple is also home to the last known hieroglyphic inscription, dedicated on August 24th of 394 AD by a pagan Egyptian priest named Nesmet-er-Achem. This inscription, known to us today as the Graffiti of Esmet-Achum, consists of a carved figure of the god Mandalus, accompanied by prayers in both the hieroglyphic and demotic scripts. The reason that we have such a precise date for the dedication of this inscription is because Nesmet-er-Achem gave us the exact date in the demotic text. He wrote that he dedicated the inscription on the birthday of Osiris in the year 110. The year given by Nesmet-er-Achem is the year according to the Anno Diocletiani or Anno Martyrum convention, the dating convention used by the Coptic Calendar. This dating convention and the Coptic Calendar itself are today most commonly associated with being part of the liturgical heritage of the Coptic Orthodox Church. So why was this pagan priest using a Christian dating convention? And where did the Coptic Calendar even come from? This will be our topic of discussion in this video. What we today call the Coptic calendar is simply the latest development of the Egyptian civil calendar, the calendar used in Egypt since pharaonic times. So let's take some time to look at the origins of this calendar and its evolution. The ancient Egyptians, like many other ancient people, began tracking time with the use of a lunar calendar. This calendar used the phases of the moon to keep time, with a full lunar cycle constituting 1 month. This early Egyptian lunar calendar is little understood. However, what we do know is that its days were individually named and celebrated as stages in the life of the moon god. Because of its many complexities and the inconsistency of the lunar year, this calendar was replaced by the Egyptian civil calendar for official use very early in the Old Kingdom. It, however, persisted to be used as a liturgical calendar by the ancient Egyptian religion. The Egyptian civil calendar is a Thothic calendar, meaning it is based on the cycle of the rising and setting of the star Sirius. The ancient Egyptians called Sirius Sopdet and worshipped it as a goddess. Sirius appears annually in the sky at dawn from around July to September and then disappears for the remainder of the year. Conveniently, the Sothic and solar years are roughly equivalent in length. Little is known about the origins of the Egyptian civil calendar, with some early scholars suggesting it may have been invented as far back as 4242 BC. What we do know for fact, however, is that it was in use by the 25th century BC and was the official calendar of the Egyptian government starting from the Old Kingdom forward. So why were the ancient Egyptians so interested in Sopdet? 3 words: the Nile Flood. The rising of Sopdet in the sky coincides with the arrival of the Nile Flood, and the Nile Flood was the most single important event of the year for the ancient Egyptians. When describing Egypt, the ancient historian Herodotus called it the gift of the Nile. This is the most fitting description of Egypt. Without the Nile, Egypt would have been identical to the deserts that flank it from both sides, inhospitable and desolate. Thus, the Egyptian civilization was totally dependent on the Nile. The ancient Egyptians understood this fact. They even associated themselves and their country with the dark soil of the Nile Valley and worshipped numerous deities associated with the Nile, including the god Hapi, who was seen as the personification of the Nile flood. Also, they worshipped Sopdet, whom we mentioned earlier, who was seen as the harbinger of the flood. In our modern minds, we envision floods to be a calamity and an unforeseen disaster. Whenever it rains, we receive flash flood warnings on our phones, and we constantly hear and read news about the victims of flooding around the world. Ever since the construction of the High Dam in Egypt, the Egyptian media has also attempted to portray the Nile flood as such a disaster, with its most recent depiction being as a comical tsunami wave that destroyed whole villages in its wake. This, however, is not a fair description of the Nile flood. The Nile flood was not really a flood as we imagine floods today. It wasn't a flood surge or a tsunami wave. During the flood season, the level of the water in the Nile rises gradually over a period of around 3 months, not as a wave in a single night. This rise is caused by the monsoon season that occurs in Ethiopia every year in late spring. The increased amount of rain during this time causes the waters of the Nile to rise, covering the floodplain. The first indications of the arrival of the flood would be seen at the first cataract in mid-June, where a small gradual increase in the level of the river would be observed. This slight increase would continue on into July. From that point forward, the increase of water would become greater and more observable. The Nile would continue to rise until September 1st, when the level would remain stationary for a period of about 3 weeks, sometimes a little less. In years with a strong flood, the waters would continue to rise again in October until the river reached its highest level. Since the flood was mild and consistent, the Egyptians knew not to build on low-lying grounds, preferring to place their settlements on the high points formed by the old levees of the river. They would also dig channels and reservoirs to manage and redirect the water. At the end of the flood season, the water would recede from the valley, uncovering freshly silted and fertilized soil, ready for sowing. The lowest level of the river would be achieved in late May, right before the start of the next flood cycle. While disasters did occur occasionally when the Nile levels were too high and would have entered the villages and cities, this was a rare occurrence and did not occur as a strong wave, but again, just a slow rise. What the ancient Egyptians actually feared the most was not a strong flood, but a weak flood, which would result in famine and drought. This huge effect which the Nile had on Egyptian culture, and its cyclical and predictable nature, is why the Egyptians based their calendar not on a simple solar cycle, but rather on the annual flooding cycle, and the rising of the star Sopdet, which, as we mentioned previously, coincided annually with the start of the flood. While we're not sure exactly where the civil calendar came from, many Egyptologists theorize that it evolved organically during the pre-dynastic period as Egyptians began keeping records of the flood. Most likely, the early Egyptians noticed the connection between the rising of Sopdet and the rising of the waters of the Nile, since at that time both events took place simultaneously in mid-June. They probably began by counting the moons from the rising of Sopdet to the maximum level of the flood. They would have also continued counting months between the high point of the flood and the receding of the waters, the point at which they could sow their fields. Finally, they would count the months between the sowing and the harvest, lapping all the way to the start of the next flood cycle. Based on rough calculations, these periods would come up to roughly 4 months each. This observation would be the basis for the Egyptian civil calendar, with its 3 seasons of Achet, the season of the flood, Peret, the season of growth, and Shemo, the season of harvest. Each season is divided into 4 months of 30 days each, and each month would be later divided into 3 10-day weeks. A final intercalary month of 5 days was added at the end of each year in order to bring the year up to 365 days, which is the number of days the ancient Egyptians had calculated for the Sothic cycle. These 5 days were celebrated as the birthdays of the 5 major deities: Osiris, Horus, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. The 12 regular months were originally nameless, being numbered within their season. For example, the first month was called First of Achet. Eventually, however, the months received names in honor of Egyptian gods and festivals. For example, the first month was renamed to Tut in honor of the god Thoth, the god of wisdom and science. And the third month was named Hathor in honor of the goddess Hathor, one of the most powerful and influential deities of the Egyptian pantheon. The second was named Paupi in honor of the Opet festival, which took place in it. This civil calendar was ideal for Egypt, since the weather remained mostly consistent year-round, and the only variable was the level of the waters of the river. The Egyptian year was so focused on the Nile and agriculture that the Egyptian word for year itself, Rompi, is derived from the word for a fresh or young plant. Those of you who have a keen eye will have noticed an issue with the calculations the ancient Egyptians made. The solar year is not 365 days. Rather, it is closer to 365 and a quarter days. This small difference between the Egyptian calculation and the actual length of the year made it so that the Egyptian calendar fell 1 day behind every 4 years. This was most obvious with the rising of Sopdet. While Sopdet was meant to rise on the first day of the year, once the calendar was implemented, the rising began moving 1 day forward every 4 years. After a cycle of 1,460 years, Sopdet would once again rise on the new year, an event known as the apoctastasis. Due to this wandering nature, the seasons of the calendar would not match the actual seasons until the calendar once more approached apoctastasis. While the Egyptians knew of this issue and complained about it extensively, they did nothing to change it. As we all know, Egyptians don't really like change. They believed that the calendar had been given to them by Thoth, the god of wisdom. So to admit that the calendar was wrong or to attempt to fix it in any way would be questioning the wisdom of the God of wisdom. Thus, changing the calendar would be a big no-no. Around 600 BC, Thos of Miletus introduced the Egyptian 365-day calendar to Greece. Unlike the Egyptians, however, he was unaware of its wandering nature. He had been convinced by the Egyptians that this was the perfect calendar handed down by the gods, and he took them at their word. A few decades down the line, however, the Greeks began to notice the seasons shifting, and they realized that the calendar was not as perfect as it seemed. They then began to make their own calculations for the actual length of the year, and they discovered that the year was roughly 365 and a quarter days. Some of the Greek city-states then began adding leap days to their calendars in order to get them to match the length of the solar year. When the Ptolemies took control of Egypt, they were keen on preserving the nation's traditions. However, this whole calendar debacle eventually became too much of a headache for them. In order to fix the issue, Ptolemy III attempted to introduce a new calendar reform in 238 BC. He ordered that every fourth year, a sixth day would be added to the intercalary month, honoring him and his wife as gods. This reform was extremely unpopular, however, and it was abandoned shortly after it was proposed. In the year 30 BC, Octavian defeated Queen Cleopatra and conquered Egypt for Rome. While in Alexandria, he noticed that the Julian calendar and the Egyptian calendar, which it was supposedly based on, were out of sync. In 25 BC, he reintroduced Ptolemy's reform, adding a sixth day to the intercalary month every fourth year. This reformed version of the calendar is what we call today the Coptic or Alexandrian calendar, which continues to be used as the liturgical calendar of the Coptic Church. So far, we have spent a great deal of time discussing the origins of the Egyptian calendar, but what is a calendar without dates? Which brings us to the next question. What dating system did the Egyptian calendar use? Originally, the Egyptian calendar used a regnal year dating system, in which time was recorded based on the reigning king. This system of regnal years was very common in the ancient Near East, and was also used in the Bible. An example of this dating convention from Egypt is the date of the famous Battle of Kadesh. The regnal year system would continue in Egypt throughout its history, even during the years of occupation. Foreign kings who controlled Egypt would be crowned as pharaohs, and their regnal years were recorded. This continued to be the practice until Diocletian became Roman emperor, and by extent pharaoh of Egypt, in 284 AD. As we discussed previously, Diocletian led the final official Roman persecution against Christians. The Church saw the reign of Diocletian and his last-ditch attempt at exterminating Christianity as the start of what is called the Christian era. As a result, during the 4th century, Christians abandoned the regnal years method of dating and began counting years from the start of the reign of Diocletian. This convention, known as the Year of the Martyrs, or Anno Martyrum, was meant to honor the martyrs who had shed their blood during the persecution. This convention would become especially popular in medieval Egypt, and it is still the convention used for the Coptic calendar by the Coptic Church. Quite ironically, the pagans of Egypt would adopt the same dating convention, but for the exact opposite reasons. When Constantine became emperor, he not only legalized Christianity, but he had himself become a Christian, though he was only baptized on his deathbed. In the view of the ancient Egyptian priesthood, this disqualified him from being pharaoh, and thus they could not really use his name for dates. So, what would they do? They could go back to using either Maximinus or Galerius, the two last pagan emperors, but they had both issued edicts of tolerance at the end of their reigns, making them no better than Constantine. The last Roman emperor to ardently and unapologetically persecute Christians was Diocletian. Since all emperors from that point forward would be Christians, excluding Julian the Apostate, the ancient Egyptian priests would continue to use the Diocletian era for rendering dates until paganism died out. Hence, the Graffito of Esmet Achum, which was dated to the year 110, Anno Diocletiani. Thus, ironically, the Egyptian pagans and the Egyptian Christians used different formulas, but wound up with the same answer. While the Coptic calendar retained the months of its civic calendar predecessor, gone were the days of the 10-day week. Instead, a 7-day week system was adopted, mirroring that found in the other Near Eastern cultures. The 7 days were known as If-Owa, meaning the first day, Episna, meaning the second day, Ipshom, the third, Epiphtho, the fourth, Ipteio, the fifth, Ipso, the sixth, and Ipshash, the seventh. 4 of these days also had secondary names by which they were commonly called. The first day was also called Tikiriaki, meaning the Lord's Day. The second day was called Ip-Abit, meaning the Moon's Day. This was also the name used for the second day of the month in ancient Egypt. The sixth day was called Tiparaskevi, meaning the preparation day. Finally, the seventh day was called Ipsabaton, meaning the Sabbath day. Unlike our modern days, which begin at midnight, the Coptic day begins at dusk after sunset. Each Coptic day is divided into 2 sections, the eve and the day. Finally, as we mentioned previously, the Egyptian calendar's seasons used to wander from the natural seasons due to the lack of a leap year. The Coptic calendar was fixed in 30 BC. The next apoctastasis, however, wouldn't have taken place until about 140 AD, nearly 170 years later. So, at the time of the fixing of the calendar, the seasons were still out of sync with the natural seasons. To fix this issue, the Coptic calendar decided to simply forget about the calendar seasons and adopt the natural seasons as they occurred at that time. This gave rise to the current Coptic seasons, each marked by a special litany within the liturgy. The Coptic Church also preserved the ancient Egyptian tradition of assigning to each day a certain religious celebration. The Church assigned to each day of the calendar a saint's feast day. The Church also replaced some of the ancient Egyptian monthly feasts with Christian ones, such as the Feast of the Archangel Michael on the 12th of each month, the Feast of the Virgin Mary on the 21st, and the Feast of the Annunciation on the 29th. While Egypt has been under Arab rule since the 7th century AD, the Arabs made no attempt at displacing the Alexandrian calendar with their own in civil matters. The Coptic calendar continued to be used as the official civic calendar of Egypt until 1875 AD, when the then ruler of Egypt, Khidewi Ismail Pasha, decided to adopt the Gregorian calendar in order to modernize the country. In addition to its continued use as the liturgical calendar of the Coptic Church, the calendar also persists in rural Egypt, especially among farmers. The calendar also persists within the common consciousness of the general Egyptian population, especially when describing certain seasonal changes in the weather. So, to summarize, the Coptic calendar is the final iteration of the ancient Egyptian civil calendar. It is not a true solar calendar, but rather it depends in its calculation on the star Sopdet, known today as Sirius, which is linked with the beginning of the Nile Flood. While the Coptic calendar fixed the wandering nature of the civil calendar and stabilized the seasons, its calculation is still off when compared with the modern Gregorian calendar. I would love to elaborate more on this final point, but as you can see, this video is already extremely long, so I will leave that issue for a future video. As for now, Ogai Chenib Choice.